One principle saved a treasure ship. Hello, this is Lessons in History with Roger Weston. Welcome to my world where history repeats itself every day. I read and analyzed over 1,000 biographies. We shine the light on great events, great villains, great disasters, and great heroes. We peel back the layers of history and uncover the principles and the strategies and tactics that can help us to overcome adversity in our own situations and come out on top. Now back to history. One of my Jake Sands thrillers was based on a shipwreck, the Capitana and the Almiranta. But before I get into that, I'd like to just tell a quick story. I used to work on a ship up in Alaska, a processor ship, and this one time we were headed up towards Dillingham, and the ship ran into a sandbar, and this was a situation. I remember I was walking down the hall when it happened, and it was like it was very smooth because it was a sandbar. It wasn't like we smashed onto the rocks. It was like shh. I heard that shh as the hull skidded onto the sandbar under the water, and then all of a sudden it just came to a fairly smooth stop. I don't think I even fell down. And next thing you know, so the captain starts running it in reverse, and this ship had massive, powerful engines. I mean, it rumbled. It felt like you were in a train, maybe in a train going over some rough tracks or something. It was extremely powerful as the captain tried to back the ship off of this sandbar, and it didn't budge. It didn't budge. And then so I went out on the back on the stern, and I was standing out there, and then he'd try to run it forward and back it off like this. And then when he did this, I mean, all this mud, we were shallow, right? All the thick clouds of mud were getting stirred up from the sandbar down below. And it was quite a moment there. And this went on for probably 20 minutes of the captain trying to back that thing off of the sandbar, and no matter how incredibly powerful these engines were, it was pretty clear that it wasn't backing off this sandbar. So what they did is they got the skiff. Now the skiff was, I don't know what it was, maybe roughly 20 feet, and it wasn't like a little fishing boat, like you'd go out on a lake. This was like, imagine this is a bulldozer of a skiff. You put it in the water, it probably weighs more than a Cadillac in terms of how heavy it was. And you put it in the water, and they hooked up a cable between now the captain does the same thing. He's trying to back off the sandbar, and you've got the skiff over here trying to pull it. And the skiff had an inboard engine, and this engine on the skiff was incredibly powerful. It was like some kind of supercharged bulldozer, and it was a really powerful boat. But even working together, these two boats could not get the ship off the sandbar. Meanwhile, the tide is going down, and pretty soon if you went up away from where all the stirred up mud was, you could actually see the bottom, and it was pretty clear we were beached. And so an hour later, we were no longer, I mean, when this all began, it was water to the horizon. As far as you could see, nothing but water. An hour later, there was no water in sight. The ship was it looked like you were in the Sahara Desert. You're sitting in the Sahara Desert on a ship, and there's nothing but sand as far as the eye can see in any direction. And so, in fact, a lot of the people on the crew went out and they actually put up they set up volleyball. They put up a volleyball net next to the ship, and they were playing volleyball out there on the ocean floor, which was now looked like the Sahara Desert. And because they have a huge up the tidal the tide drops a lot up there. I don't know if it's 20 feet or something. It's dramatic. And so anyway, we had to wait for the incoming tide, which was several hours. And eventually the tide came back and it just lifted us up off the sandbar. And that was how that guy got out of his, that captain got out of his problem. Was he depended on, no, he would, there's an old saying, a rising tide lifts all boats. Well, that's what lifted his boat off, was the rising tide. Well, so back in 1654, Admiral de Solis, Admiral de Solis is leading his boat, his treasure ships up the west coast of South America. And they ran into trouble. They ran into a situation where they're caught up in a bunch of reefs, and two of the boats ran aground on reefs. Now this is not a smooth thing like what I was talking about in Alaska, where it goes and no damage was done to the hull. It was very smooth. You're just grounded. No, they ran up on reefs, which is brutal. You can imagine it, like you're walking along the deck and all of a sudden you're thrown down to the floor and maybe you break your jaw on some cargo. So it was a harsh deal. Now two of the ships were run onto these reefs, and this happened about 40 miles from Guayaquil. And so they were in desperate straits here. In fact, this was an area known for this kind of problem. And so what Admiral de Solis did was to lighten the load. He had to lighten his load in order to get his ship up off the reef. And now what he did was he cut the anchor. He let the anchors fall. And fortunately that lifted the boat up enough for him to to get his shoreboat out there, just like what happened on my ship. They got the shoreboat out. They had, back then in 1654, they had 8 guys in there rowing ferociously, with all of their energy and back strength. They were rowing fiercely, these 8 guys in their skiff, and they actually pulled it off the reef after they dropped the anchor and lightened the load a little bit. So meanwhile, on the other ship nearby, the Capitana, chaos was reigning on decks. People were in a panic. They were in a panic because they felt they were going to die. Many of these people were abandoning ship because the ships were taking on water. You can imagine the terror, the utter terror of being out to sea, and all of a sudden your ship is taking on water and you're stuck. If you've ever been at sea and you've been knowing that you are moments away from death, it's a terrifying feeling. And you can imagine, so that's the situation that these people were in. Many of them literally jumped overboard. They abandoned ship. Unfortunately, however, they made one crucial mistake when they abandoned ship. They didn't lighten their load. They took their gold with them. These people were loaded with wealth, with gold from the mines. And so many of them couldn't let go of their gold. So they jumped overboard with their gold strapped to it, their money belts and everything, and they went straight down to the bottom, and that was that. General de Sousa, in charge of the Capitana, ordered that all the masts be cut on his ship and thrown overboard in order to lighten the load of the ship. And they did that, and then at high tide, between the rising tide and the mast thrown overboard, they were able to get off the reef, and then using the spirit sail, they were able to thread their way up through a channel between perilous reefs, and they got within 40 leagues of the shore. Well, 40 not. They got actually a lot closer than that. I got my numbers wrong. That's 40 leagues south of Guayaquil. They got fairly near to shore before they wrecked upon some rocks, and it was close enough to shore that they were able to get ashore, and then later on it was shallow enough water there that later on they were able to come back and recover the gold from the sunken ship. So obviously the message here is sometimes in our own lives we have situations where you know we're burdened, things maybe aren't going the way we want them to be going, and one thing to look at is do we need to lighten our load? Are we burdened? And for example, a more contemporary example, I've heard a football coach talk about how the things weren't going very well with his team. So what did he do? He thinned down his playbook. He had too many plays and it was bogging down the system. So he had to lighten the load, get rid of a lot of the plays, thin down the book, and simplify things. So anyway, we can maybe find situations in our own life. Is there anything bogging us down, holding us back? Do we need to lighten our own load? Comment below. We'll see you at the next report. From Lessons in History, I'm Roger Weston.